Someone in a tailored suit just leaned forward across their immaculate desk, adjusted their expensive glasses, and asked the question they thought would corner you. Who trained you? And in that instant the air shifted. They expected a name, a program, a certificate, some neat lineage they could verify, categorize, and file away in their well-organized database. They were waiting for you to drop a mentor's name, to recite your institutional pedigree, to hand them the receipt for your evolution, as if you'd purchased it from some strip mall seminar. But instead, you smiled, the kind of smile that makes their pen pause mid-signature, and said the only truth that ever mattered. Nobody did. That's when their confusion started to curdle into something else, something that looked a lot like fear, barely disguised behind a business-casual mask. Because in that moment, they realized they were sitting across from something they couldn't track, couldn't predict, couldn't control through their usual systems. People like you don't fit their frameworks, you're self-forged, the kind who weaponized isolation, who turned abandonment into a research lab. They've got policies for graduates, pipelines for certified professionals, protocols for those molded by approved systems. But you learned in the basement of your own breakdown, studied at the University of No One Cares, and earned your degree in the school of figure it out or die trying. There's no accreditation board for that kind of curriculum, no alumni network for those who taught themselves mastery while everyone else was collecting participation trophies. You didn't have a coach. You had consequence. You didn't have a trainer. You had survival instinct sharpened by a learning curve that would snap most minds like dry twigs. And now here you are sitting in their boardroom, their office, their interview space, armed with skills they can't source and knowledge they can't verify. It drives them insane because their entire world runs on traceability, on knowing origin so they can predict outcomes. But you're the glitch in their algorithm, the variable that breaks their equation, the answer that doesn't fit the test key. They wanted to hear about universities, programs, recognizable institutions that would let them exhale and think, good, we understand this one. We can measure them, define them, predict their ceiling. Instead, they got you, unmeasured, unmeasurable, with a skill ceiling that disappears into clouds they can't even see. Let me tell you what really happened during all those years when nobody was training you. While everyone else was busy collecting their certificates and credentials, you were supposedly falling behind. But you weren't. You were learning different lessons, the kind no accredited program could ever teach. You learned how to build systems from broken parts, how to extract wisdom from failure, how to turn every setback into a case study, and every betrayal into research data. While they memorized approved curricula, you were dissecting reality itself, teaching yourself to see patterns and chaos, to find structure and destruction, to turn raw experience into understanding forged in survival rather than simulation. You didn't become dangerous because someone handed you knowledge. You became dangerous because you hunted it down, dragged it from the wilderness, and consumed it raw. While they thought you were lost, you were sharpening yourself. Those quiet years when you vanished from social media, stopped updating your professional profile, and disappeared from the stage where everyone performed their progress. Those were the years you were building something no one could see. They assumed you were struggling, falling behind, missing your moment while they climbed their corporate ladders and stacked their shiny new titles. But you weren't lost. You were learning in dimensions they couldn't comprehend, studying in classrooms without walls or permission. You were observing human behavior in its most unfiltered form, watching how people move when they think no one's watching. You learned psychological warfare on the front lines of your own relationships. You mastered emotional intelligence not through workshops or self-help manuals, but through the brutal, relentless education of pain and adaptation. And here's the beautiful, terrifying truth. You learned faster, deeper, and more completely than any of their institutional products ever could. When survival is your teacher, every lesson cuts to the bone. When reality is your curriculum, there's no curve, no retakes, no safety nets. You either learned or you didn't survive to see the next day. And the fact that you're still here means you mastered every lesson they try to simulate in their classrooms. But you learned it true. You learned it permanently. You learned it in ways that can't be undone. Even if you wanted to forget, you couldn't. You became a kind of educated their institutions can't replicate, a kind of skilled their systems can't measure, a kind of dangerous their background checks can't detect. So when that person in the suit leans forward and asks with that polite skepticism, "Who trained you?" what they're really asking is something else entirely. How do we categorize you? How do we measure someone who exists beyond our known standards? What they're really asking is, how do we predict whether you'll fit inside our system? Because when you tell them nobody trained me, what you're actually saying is, I'm unpredictable, I'm unmeasurable. I built myself from the ground up using materials you don't understand and methods you would never approve of. And that's what unsettles them. Not a gap in your resume or a missing credential, but the existential crisis of facing competence that doesn't have a traceable origin. People like that, gatekeepers of conventional success, need origin stories. They need to know where you came from so they can feel safe, so they can map your abilities onto their framework of limits and blind spots. If they can define your source, they can define your ceiling. But you don't have an origin story. You have an origin myth. Something that sounds impossible when told in full. Something that makes them squirm because it implies their entire structure for learning, development, and mastery might be incomplete. You are living proof that their way isn't the only way, that institutional validation isn't the only route to competence, and that some of the most lethal forms of intelligence are born from necessity, not permission. Watch their faces when you explain it. When you talk about learning negotiation because you had nothing left to trade, about mastering persuasion just to survive conversations with people who wanted you gone, about developing strategy not in classrooms, but in the chaos of betrayal, armed with nothing but your mind. Watch how the professional curiosity drains from their expressions, replaced by a quiet recalibration. Because what you're describing doesn't sound like training, it sounds like trauma. It sounds like pain alchemized into precision, survival turned into skill, and that realization shakes them because you shouldn't be this good, you shouldn't be this sharp, not without their institutions, their mentors, their step-by-step roadmaps. Yet here you are, demonstrably capable, impossible to dismiss, a contradiction to everything they were taught to believe about success. The real question isn't who trained you, it's how did someone with no formal training become this effective? And that question terrifies them because your existence challenges the foundation of their entire system. If someone like you, someone who learned in isolation through necessity, through failure, can outperform people who paid 6 figures for Ivy League pedigrees, then what does that say about the value of those institutions? What does it reveal about human potential when the one who had nothing but time, pain, and willpower surpasses the ones with access to the best resources on earth? You're not just a person sitting in their office. You're a philosophical disruption wearing business casual, answering their questions with a calm that borders on dangerous. And here's what they'll never admit, even to themselves. In those quiet moments when they review your file and try to reconcile your background with your results, you threaten them. Not because you're hostile or arrogant, but because you prove their system isn't absolute. You prove that excellence can emerge from anywhere, that greatness doesn't need their stamp of approval, and that their gatekeeping was never the final word on who gets to be exceptional. You are their nightmare scenario, a walking contradiction to the institutions that claim to be the only source of legitimate expertise. You learned without them, you succeeded without them, you became formidable in spite of them, and now here you are in their domain, speaking their language, playing their game, and winning. Except you're not just playing their game, you've rewritten it. You're operating within their world, but on your own terms, guided by rules they've never seen, using strategies they don't even realize exist. Every move you make seems familiar to them on the surface, structured, professional, efficient. But underneath, it's powered by principles forged in a crucible they'll never understand. You learn strategy not from lectures or leadership seminars, but from necessity. You wrote your own rulebook in the dark at moments when failure wasn't theoretical, but personal and immediate. You learned the mechanics of survival and turned them into the architecture of excellence. You speak their language, but with an accent that doesn't trace back to any institution they know. It's an accent shaped by late nights staring at failure until it revealed its structure. By years of figuring out how to turn scarcity into creativity and chaos into precision, you learn to speak the dialect of action, the tone of consequence, the grammar of results. And though they can't place where it comes from, they feel the weight of it, the authenticity that can't be mimicked, the authority that isn't granted by titles but earned through scars. Every answer you give hits the mark, but it lands from an angle they never predicted. Every solution you offer works, but the logic behind it lives outside their frameworks. You see patterns they've been trained to ignore. You connect dots they don't even notice exist. You've become functionally multilingual in the language of competence, able to think in systems, adapt across disciplines, and switch between abstract and tactical thinking without effort. It's a level of versatility that can't be taught in any classroom because it's learned through raw exposure to uncertainty, through years of doing without guidance, through bleeding for every insight. And it's making them uneasy in ways they can't articulate. You can see it in the subtle shifts, the tapping of a pen, the forced laughter, the long pause before they ask the next question. They wanted to know who trained you so they could track you, verify you, contain you. They wanted a point of reference, some name they could call, some paper trail they could follow, some institution that could validate you according to their narrow hierarchy of legitimacy. But there's nobody to call. There's no certification to scan, no LinkedIn endorsement to read. Your education was invisible. Your witnesses were the walls that heard you swear under your breath, the silence that sat beside you as you built yourself back up night after night. You were your own witness, your own mentor, your own judge and jury. To them, that makes you unreliable until you perform, until they watch you do what their certified experts can't, until they see you untangle chaos in minutes that would take others weeks, until they realize your lack of formal training isn't a deficit. It's the reason you move differently, think faster, and operate with an edge their systems never produce. And when they see that, the tone changes. Suddenly, who trained you becomes, how do we keep you? The curiosity turns into urgency, the skepticism into quiet desperation. Because now they see what you are, and they know they can't replicate it. But here's the part that keeps them awake at night, staring at spreadsheets and re-watching your interview footage, trying to find the glitch in their understanding. You don't need them. Not really. Not in the way most people do. You're immune to their leverage. You've trained yourself to survive without the resources, titles, or approval they use to control others. You've lived without their validation long enough to realize it was never worth chasing. That's what terrifies them most. You can walk away at any time. They can't threaten to revoke credentials you never earned. They can't use institutional relationships to manipulate you because you never built your identity around belonging to their world. They can't trap you in bureaucracy because you've already lived through worse. You are frictionless within their systems, too independent to contain, too self-sufficient to manage. They've spent their whole careers mastering control through access, and you've just demonstrated that you can operate without any of it. That makes you an anomaly. And in their world, anomalies are dangerous. The skills you have, the ones they marvel at and quietly fear, didn't come from textbooks or structured mentorship. They came from chaos, from the long grind of figuring things out alone. You learn systems thinking by necessity, leadership through survival, and creativity through desperation. They can't commodify that. They can't turn it into a training module, can't bottle it into a leadership program, can't replicate it in a lab. They can teach people about resilience, but they can't make them live it. They can quote books on emotional intelligence, but they'll never understand what it means to actually bleed for it. You are the end product of a process they can't control, package, or sell. You're the proof that greatness doesn't need permission. That mastery can come from pain as much as from privilege. And that makes you untouchable in a way that no title, no salary, no certification could ever make someone. You are the glitch in the hierarchy, the one they can't label, can't measure, can't contain. You're the living contradiction that exposes the truth they've been trained to deny. That the system was never the source of excellence. People like you are. And that realization terrifies them more than anything. Because if someone who was never trained, never funded, never endorsed can rise to this level of precision, intelligence, and impact, then what does that say about their institutions? What does it say about the billions spent on programs, degrees, and certifications designed to manufacture what you became through pure will? You didn't just beat the system, you rendered it optional. And that's the kind of threat that can't be fired, categorized, or contained. It can only be respected or feared. What you learned wasn't some neatly organized instructor-approved curriculum. It was custom-built for your survival, carved from chaos and refined by necessity. Every skill you possess was tailored perfectly to the storms you had to weather, designed unconsciously through trial, error, pain, and persistence. There's no academic equivalent to that kind of learning. It's not something you can reproduce in a sterile classroom or replicate with step-by-step training modules. Your education was alive, raw, unstable, ever-shifting, constantly reshaping itself around whatever was threatening to destroy you next. It wasn't about theory, it was about survival. And survival doesn't care about credentials. It cares about what works. You are bespoke competence in a world obsessed with mass production, handcrafted brilliance in a marketplace that rewards standardization. You don't fit into their efficiency models because you were never designed to. You are the opposite of their predictability, a living, breathing contradiction to their systems. Every insight you carry is unique to the path you walked, forged in conditions no focus group could reproduce. So when they lean back in those sleek, ergonomic chairs, adjusting their ties and processing your words, "Nobody trained me," you can feel the air tighten. Because in that moment, they're not just hearing defiance. They're confronting the collapse of their assumptions. They built entire frameworks to measure and categorize people like you, and yet none of them work. Every model they use to evaluate potential starts to short-circuit when they try to map your growth. Every theory they trust about professional development becomes irrelevant in your presence. They realize, maybe for the first time, that not all mastery is measurable. You are the exception that shatters their rule, the outlier that exposes the narrowness of their bell curve. You're not a statistical anomaly. You're evidence that their understanding of growth, talent, and evolution has been incomplete all along. You're the kind of data point that forces uncomfortable questions. If someone like you exists, what else have they been missing? Let's strip away their illusions and talk about what really happened during your training. Because while they were collecting certificates in perfectly climate-controlled classrooms, you were learning the hard way through fire, failure, and repetition. You didn't learn emotional regulation from guided meditations or therapy sessions. You learned it from trying to stay composed while your world disintegrated around you. You didn't develop stress management through bullet point lists and wellness workshops. You learned it through functioning under pressure so intense it should have broken you. You didn't master focus from productivity podcasts. You learned it because losing focus meant losing everything. You learned patience when life refused to move faster, persistence when there were no shortcuts, and resilience when breaking down became so routine that rebuilding yourself was the only thing left to do. You became fluent in adaptation, constantly evolving to meet the next impossible situation. While others learned resilience as a buzzword, you lived it as a requirement. You didn't read about grit, you became it. You didn't attend lectures on perseverance. You embodied it every time you had to keep going despite every reason not to. In their institutions, they teach conflict resolution through controlled scenarios, case studies, simulations, and scripted exercises where mistakes are harmless. You learned it through real conflict, through conversations that could end relationships, through arguments that carried stakes no classroom could simulate. You learned to de-escalate tension, not for grades, but for survival. You learned to read rooms, not to impress management, but to detect danger before it arrived. You learned to navigate power dynamics, not from textbooks, but from understanding how fragile safety can be in environments built on unspoken hierarchies. Your education wasn't theoretical. It was live fire training from the first day. There were no practice rounds, no doovers, no instructors to guide your hand. Every mistake cost something. Every success required blood, focus, and emotional endurance. And somehow through it all, you didn't just survive. You refined. You became someone capable of functioning under the kind of pressure that most people only encounter in crisis simulations. The end.